committee will please come to order. A quorum is present. The committee meets today pursuant to notice to consider a Congressional Review Act resolution, HJ Res. 116, providing for congressional disapproval under Chapter 8 of Title 5, United States Code, of the rules submitted by the Department of Labor relating to employee or independent contractor classification under the Fair Labor Standards Act, and 3 bills, H.R. 6418, Empower Charter School Educators to Lead Act, H.R. 3724, Accreditation for College Excellence Act of 2023, and H.R. 7683, Respecting the First Amendment on Campus Act. The chair announces that requests for recorded votes as to amendments may be postponed pursuant to Clause 2 of Rule 11 of the Rules of the House of Representatives and Committee Rule 14B. Without objection, the chair may recess the committee at any point. The committee is meeting today to discuss 4 great measures on the agenda. Thank you to my colleagues, Representatives Owens, Williams, Letlow, and Kiley, for taking the lead on these measures and putting in the hard work in the drafting process. Thanks to each individual member's efforts, the committee is building an impressive record in the 118th Congress. We're fulfilling our duty as members of the People's House and delivering legislative solutions for our constituents. On education issues, the committee has produced bill after bill that strengthens parents' rights, lowers college costs, and emphasizes greater student achievement. Now the committee has 3 more education bills to consider. These bills are a stake in the ground. They say the committee will not surrender our schools to either the woke ideologues or the ballooning education bureaucracy. While the left-wing capture of institutions is of great concern to my side of the aisle, we should be careful not to beat the left by becoming the left. Public colleges should not adhere to a certain ideology, right or left, but rather maintain viewpoint neutrality. Representative Owens' Accreditation for College Excellence, ACE Act, ensures colleges are not forced to commit to the principles of DEI to receive accreditation. No institution should be required to conform to a politically charged ideology to gain access to federal financial aid. Moreover, Representative Williams' Respecting the First Amendment on Campus Act ensures the full sweep of the First Amendment is adhered to by public college campuses. This means no more compelling students and faculty to make commitments to ideologies through political litmus tests for admissions and hiring, no more religious discrimination, and no more restrictive free speech zones. The entirety of a public university campus should be a free speech zone, where students are exposed to different opinions, learn how to debate contested ideas, think critically, and discover truth. Together, these bills will achieve that mission. Today, we will also consider the bipartisan Empower Charter School Educators to Lead Act, authored by Representative Letlow. This legislation embraces the themes of increased freedom and educational opportunity at the elementary and secondary level. Charter schools are bastions of innovation and choice in a public education ecosystem otherwise dominated by bureaucracy and entrenched special interests. This bill will unleash the full potential of charters by allowing a modest amount of federal funds to aid the application process. It does so without adding a single dollar in new spending. I urge every member to support these 3 education priorities. On workforce issues, the committee's built a strong reputation for protecting workers from regulatory overreach by an activist Department of Labor. Today, we will grow that reputation by passing Representative Kiley's Congressional Review Act resolution. Under no previous administration has the ability for American free enterprise been more under attack. What's more, the fundamental right for workers to earn an honest living on their own terms is even at stake. Allowing for entrepreneurship through pursuits such as independent contracting is how we will repair the American economy, not through bad government regulations that destroy the freedom to work independently. Effective March 11, the Biden DOL issued a rule that threatens to eliminate the livelihoods of tens of millions of independent contractors across the country. Independent contracting is the preferred model for so many because it affords workers the flexibility to control their own careers and work-life balance. It is imperative that the committee stands as a bulwark against the DOL's independent contractor overreach. Therefore, I support Representative Kiley's Congressional Review Act resolution to disapprove of the rule to return to the previous rule that has allowed millions of American entrepreneurs to continue earning a living in the method that they prefer. With that, I want to say thank you again to each of my colleagues for leading on these measures. I look forward to delivering them to the full House for consideration. I yield to the ranking member for an opening statement.
Thank you, Dr. Fox, and good morning. Similar to most markups that we have had in this Congress, a committee of Republicans are rallying behind another set of bills that shirk our responsibilities to workers, students, and their families. First proposal we will consider, H.J. Res. 116, will repeal the Biden administration's final rule determining whether or not a worker is classified as an employee or independent contractor. Under federal law, employees have a wide range of basic workforce protections, including minimum wage, overtime, employer-provided health care insurance and pension benefits, collective bargaining, unemployment compensation, workers' compensation, and health and safety protections. But when workers who should be employees under the law are instead misclassified as independent contractors, they lose out on these protections. This can mean a significant loss of income, benefits, and compensation. It's not just workers who are harmed by misclassifications. For decades, unscrupulous employers who have used misclassification as a strategy to cut down on labor costs and exploit both insufficient penalties and the limited capacity of underfunded enforcement agencies. There are, in fact, estimates that 10 to 30% of employers are currently misclassifying their employees. Those unscrupulous employers who misclassify workers can save about 30% in labor costs and gain an unfair competitive advantage over the employers who play by the rules. They have less incentive to invest in training their workforce to be safer and more efficient. And finally, worker misclassification harms our economy by depriving our government of billions of dollars of badly needed tax revenue that could be spent on improving our economies. H.J. Res. 116 would lead to more worker misclassification, which would harm workers, law-abiding business owners, and our economy. We'll next consider H.R. 6418, which expands pre-planning grants for charter schools with even less transparency and accountability than is already permitted under current law. My colleagues want to expand charter schools despite numerous audits that identify accountability and transparency issues within charter schools that lead to waste, fraud, and abuse of taxpayers' dollars. This is yet another demonstration of the majority's efforts to expand school choice instead of improving public schools while ignoring the need for guardrails and exposing children to low-quality educational experiences. Committee Democrats will introduce amendments that will add basic guardrails and will help students access a fair and just education. The next bill we will consider, H.R. 3724, is a veiled attack on diversity and academic freedom in college curricula. It mirrors language in the Republican so-called College Cost Reduction Act, which forces colleges and universities to ban diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI initiatives, as a condition for accreditation. Finally, the last bill before us, H.R. 7683, will create a new standard of free speech and other First Amendment protections for institutions of higher education. The bill's solutions are not designed to protect free marketplace of ideas on college campuses, but rather lift up speech that conservatives support and eliminate speech that conservatives oppose. Additionally, H.R. 7683 gives preferential treatment to religious student organizations, exempting them from non-discrimination rules that apply to all other student groups. If passed, it could result in a situation where students are forced to support, with their tuition and fees, groups that couldn't discriminate against them in the name of religion. H.R. 7683 is inconsistent with the principles of the First Amendment, that this country was founded on, and for those reasons, I will oppose this bill. These four proposals will do nothing to improve the lives of American students, workers, and families, and for that reason, I'll oppose all of them and urge my colleagues to do as well. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. Without objection, all other members who wish to insert written opening statements into the record may do so by submitting them to the committee clerk electronically by the end of the day today. House rules require that a copy of the measures be made available to members and the public at least 24 hours in advance. Pursuant to the notice for today's meeting, a copy of the measures was made available to members and the public at least 24 hours in advance. The resolution and bills being marked up today shall be open to amendments at any point, and the chair will allow members to offer amendments in a manner not prohibited by House or committee rules. Without objection, members who have more than one amendment to the resolution or to a bill and wish to offer their amendments en bloc may do so. The committee will now proceed to the consideration of the resolution H.J. Res. 116 for amendment. The resolution was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the resolution.
H.J. Res. 116, providing for congressional disapproval under Chapter 8 of Title 5, United States Code, of the rules submitted by the Department of Labor relating to employer independent contractor classification under the Fair Labor Standards Act.
Without objection, the first reading of the resolution is dispensed with. Are there any members who wish to be recognized for further discussion on the resolution? Representative Kiley, do you wish to be recognized?
Yes, Madam Chair.
I recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is a resolution under the Congressional Review Act to nullify the Department of Labor's new independent contractor rule. This rule is a threat to the livelihood of millions of Americans. It is the last thing our workforce needs right now. It is the last thing our economy needs right now. This rule makes it harder for individuals to continue operating as independent contractors who are self-employed individuals contracted to perform work or provide services to another person or business. Workers, employers, and consumers have long benefited from independent work and the opportunity for workers and businesses to pursue the American dream. Independent contractors have the freedom to choose their own work schedules. Employers maintain flexibility to adjust work demands with business needs, and consumers benefit from a reduction in the cost of goods and services. President Biden's Department of Labor issued a final rule in January, which could destroy the independent contractor model as we know it. The rule is modeled on a law from California, known as AB 5. It's an infamous law because its harmful effects are now so clearly recognized. It's been condemned, AB 5 has, from across the political spectrum. In fact, the law is so damaging that the legislature in California has now created exemptions from the law for 109 categories of workers. And a recent study provided empirical support for what we've known since the law was enacted. It showed that there's been a 10.5% decline in self-employment since this law went into effect in California, and a 4.4% decline in overall employment. That is tens of thousands of livelihoods that have been destroyed. Now, the evidence on AB 5 is so clear that the supporters of the Biden administration's rule have tried to dissociate the new rule from AB 5 to say that it's somehow something different. And this just isn't so. The reason we know that is because President Biden has explicitly said that AB 5 is his model for labor relations nationwide. And of all the people that he could have chosen to nominate for Secretary of Labor, he picked the very architect of AB 5 itself, Julie Su, who as the Secretary of Labor in California was responsible for enforcing AB 5 to such a devastating effect. But even putting that aside, even without considering the precedent of AB 5, this rule is extremely problematic on its face. The rule says that no one factor is dispositive, and the weight given each factor may depend on the facts and circumstances of the particular relationship. There are 6 factors overall, so this means that the Department of Labor will use all 6 factors as broadly as possible to find independent contractors are employees. Among other concerning provisions is the factor regarding whether a worker is, quote, an integral part of the company's business. What is considered integral is ill-defined and will result in confusion and invite frivolous litigation that could ultimately have a chilling effect on independent work opportunities and entrepreneurship generally. And indeed, when we had the administrator of the Wage and Hour Division before my subcommittee recently, I asked her some very straightforward questions as to how realtors would be classified, as to how truckers would be classified, as to how journalists would be classified, and she could not give an answer to any of those questions. And so it raises the question as to how our workforce is supposed to respond to a rule that not even the administrator seems to understand. A report from Credit Summit found that of the roughly 73 million American independent contractors, only 9% would prefer to have a traditional job, compared to 79% of them who prefer the freelancing status that they have. In 2021, the Trump Department of Labor published a workable standard that simplified the economic realities and worker classification test under the Fair Labor Standards Act. Under this approach, there were 2 core factors that guided worker classification determinations: the nature and degree of the worker's control over the work and the worker's opportunity for profit or loss. This approach clarified the department's interpretation of worker classification status under the Fair Labor Standards Act, provided more certainty for workers and employers, and promoted economic growth. Unfortunately, the 2021 standard has been replaced by this new rule, which went into effect on March 11th. This Department of Labor rule should be rescinded, and instead, we should have a rule that supports work and small businesses and supports self-employed workers and removes impediments for those who wish to pursue independent work or do business with the independent contractor workforce. So I encourage members of the committee on both sides of the aisle to come together to support our workers and to support our economy and to rescind this harmful rule. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kiley. Dr. Adams, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized.
I rise in opposition to H.J. Res. 116. The Department of Labor's final rule is a crucial first step in curbing worker misclassification. Misclassifying workers is an intentional and anti-competitive business practice across many industries. The final rule provides greater clarity and consistency through codifying the long-standing 6-factor economic reality test. In contrast to the prior rule, which is repealed as part of the final rule makes clear that no factor or set of factors would have a predetermined weight. The final rule would further advise that costs to a worker which a potential employer unilaterally imposes are not investments indicative of independent contractor status. After reiterating these principles that come from decades of precedents, the final rule adds a useful clarification that the whole point of this exercise is to ask if workers are truly in business for themselves. If not, they are likely employees. And while many states have acted to combat blatant work misclassification, as Congress ignored the problem, it has become exceedingly difficult for legitimate contractors to compete against contractors who constantly misclassify a majority of their workforce. Misclassification is done to gain a major competitive advantage against law-abiding competitors, realize tremendous profits, and avoid the financial risks that honest entrepreneurs must accept. Contractors that engage in worker status fraud do not bear the risks of unanticipated overtime, bad planning, or poor execution. Study after study has shown that bad actors can reduce their labor tax and benefit obligation costs by as much as 50% by engaging in worker status fraud. In past sessions of Congress, bipartisan bills designed to combat worker status fraud gained support but failed to pass. So I do urge my colleagues to vote no on this legislation. With that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Adams. Mr. Walberg, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized.
Thank you. I rise in strong support of H.J. Res. 116, which would overturn the Department of Labor's misguided rule that hamstrings workers and job creators. Polls consistently show that independent work is immensely popular. A recent study by Upwork found that almost 40% of the U.S. workforce participated in freelance work in 2023. Many cited the increased flexibility, autonomy, and increased earning power as a huge attraction, and why wouldn't it be? A report from Credit Summit found that of the roughly 73 million American independent contractors, only 9% would prefer to have a traditional job, compared to 79% of them who prefer freelancing. This rule, modeled after California's AB 5, would put American workers and entrepreneurs on the chopping block and would involuntarily reclassify millions of independent contractors, jeopardizing their employment and the economic opportunity of millions of Americans. As my colleague from California noted, AB 5 has been a case study in disastrous policy for workers and employers, and I would say another case study in destructive socialism. Rather than making it easier for people to join the workforce, the Biden administration is putting up yet another roadblock and barrier to entry. Madam Chair, the Biden rule is unworkable, unwelcome by millions of independent workers across this country. I urge my colleagues to support H.J. Res. 116, and I thank my friend from California for his continued efforts on this legislation. And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Walberg. Congressman Scott, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, when employers misclassify their workers as independent contractors instead of employees, they set off a series of negative consequences like dominoes falling one by one. First, the workers who are misclassified are immediately robbed of core workplace protections. For example, they lose the right to minimum wage, they lose the right to overtime, right to organize, right to a safe workplace, the right to unemployment compensation and workers' compensation. They lose the right to access to the employer-provided health care and pensions. They lose OSHA protections. And when misclassified workers seek protections under these laws, they are immediately challenged and must waste time proving that they're actually employees. When you say that people, it's popular to become independent contractors, I don't know how popular it is to give away your right to minimum wage, overtime, and all your other rights. These employers also gain an unfair advantage over their law-abiding competitors, saving as much as 30% in taxes and other expenses, and the public is harmed as well. Employers who misclassify workers skip out on unemployment insurance, workers' comp, payroll taxes, and the portion that employers have to pay for Social Security and Medicare. The IRS last estimated the cost to the federal government alone from misclassification in 1984. They estimated then it was $1.6 billion, or roughly $4.8 billion in today's dollars. Given all that we know about the harms of misclassification, it makes no sense that we're considering a resolution to turn the clock back and put back in place a Trump administration rule that encouraged misclassification. According to the Economic Policy Institute, the Trump rule that this resolution would bring back to life would cost workers more than $3 billion each year in lost wages. This resolution would also force a radical change from the long-settled law. The Supreme Court and other courts have spent the better part of the last 85 years interpreting the broad definition of employment in the Fair Labor Standards Act with a multi-part economic realities test, as the gentlelady from North Carolina has indicated. This test has been the law of the land for decades, and it doesn't have just one factor, because if you had one factor, employers, that factor could be subject to employers gaming the system and ending up with more employees being misclassified as independent contractors. When the Trump administration attempted in 2021 to rewrite the Supreme Court law and decades of precedent through a regulation challenging the economic realities test, the Trump rule was a radical disruption of settled law. The Biden administration fixed this problem by rescinding the Trump rule and clarifying that the law of the land remained the law of the land. This resolution would put us back where the Trump administration left us, with a rule with dubious legality that radically upends the law, and we have known it to be for decades. And as a result, workers and law-abiding employers who play by the rules would all be put at risk. I don't know how to put it more plainly. If this resolution passes, it will take money out of workers' pockets. This is not how the committee should be spending its precious time. Representative DeLauro and I have introduced a bill to stop wage theft. We should mark up that bill, not this resolution, which would make wage theft easier. Representative Adams and I have asked the committee not once but twice to hold a hearing on the crisis of child labor. We should be spending our time resolving that problem, not creating new ones. So I urge my fellow members to vote no, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. Mr. Allen, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Chair, I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
In yet another crushing blow to the American workforce, President Biden's Department of Labor recently finalized an overly restrictive independent contractor rule that will devastate millions of workers and businesses, eliminate employment opportunities, and topple the gig economy. That is why included in my Employee Rights Act is a provision that would create a clear definition across federal laws to protect independent workers and provide essential protections for workers' rights, their choices, and freedoms in the 21st century economy. Because congressional Democrats have continuously failed to pass their Radical PRO Act, which would significantly narrow the definition of an independent contractor, President Biden is now doing their bidding, weaponizing the DOL to circumvent the legislative process altogether. Biden's rule on independent contractors circumvents Congress, the people's representation, to enact a disastrous policy similar to that of California's Assembly Bill 5. AB 5, enacted in January 2020, led to countless Californians who were working as freelance employees losing their income just weeks before the COVID pandemic. This is one of the many reasons that there are now 109 categories of workers who are exempt from AB 5. As I visit with small business owners across Georgia's 12th district, the number one issue I hear is the need for a workforce. To eliminate an employment model that has allowed millions of Americans to have the flexibility they need and helped countless individuals achieve the American dream is inconceivable. Let's be clear. The Democrats want to take us back in time. We have a modern workforce, an entrepreneurial workforce. They're not interested in the old ways. They're interested in moving forward. This is what this rule does. It takes us back in time, and the business community is moving forward. This is why I encourage all my colleagues to vote in favor of this common sense CRA to disapprove and nullify the DOL's final rule. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. Ms. Hayes, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized.
I am strongly opposed to this legislation, which would turn back the clock on labor protections and make it harder for workers to organize. Worker misclassification is a significant issue in this country. Audits have found that as many as 10 to 30% of American employers misclassify workers as independent contractors rather than employees. The final rule issued by the Biden administration will make it harder for corporations to avoid accountability for wage theft or unfair labor practices. Unfortunately, Republicans on this committee want to make it easier for corporations to deny workers benefits like overtime, workers' compensation, and minimum wage. But this is not the first time Republicans are trying to make it easier for employers to get off the hook from their responsibilities under our labor and employment laws from Congress. About 4 months ago, this committee held hearings and a markup on H.J. Res. 98, which would have overturned a National Labor Relations Board rule related to the determination of joint employer status. A November 2023 report by the Century Foundation found up to 2.1 million construction workers in the United States are illegally misclassified. This report found that in my home state of Connecticut, which is among the top 5 in the cost of worker compensation insurance premiums, also has one of the highest estimated rates of miscalculation. Estimates show that home health aides lost more than $9,500 in wages, and construction workers nearly $17,000 each year due to illegal misclassification. Additionally, misclassified workers are unable to collectively bargain for higher wages, better benefits, or even safer working conditions. This resolution does not help workers. It only serves to deny workers their rights while enabling the worst behavior by employers. I urge my colleagues to vote against this resolution, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Hayes. Mr. Good, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized.
I'm proud to co-sponsor and support H.J. Res. 116, a resolution that nullifies the Biden administration's rule that will radically transform independent contractor status for the millions of Americans who enjoy it. Biden's rule will cause independent contractors across the country to be classified as employees. This is yet another attempt by the Biden administration to conspire with big labor to subject every worker to coercive labor unions. It's not the government's job to make decisions for Americans. Say it again, it's not the government's job to make decisions for Americans. How have we gotten to the point where we tolerate that from our federal government? Even worse, it's not the job of the federal government to make decisions for Americans. The federal government, the most distant, ineffective, inefficient of all government agencies. I know that it's just that pesky, inconvenient nuisance of a Constitution, but have Democrats ever heard of the Ninth Amendment? I would yield to one who wants to tell me what the Ninth Amendment says right here at this moment. What's the Ninth Amendment say? The Ninth Amendment says the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage other rights retained by the people. This means that since the Constitution doesn't deny Americans the right to decide for themselves the questions of today, employment status, union status, and so forth, that it's left to the people. How about the 10th Amendment? We talk about a lot of amendments. We don't talk a lot about the 9th and 10th Amendment. 10th Amendment says the powers not delegated to the United States, meaning the federal government, by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or the people. That means that unless the powers are given to the federal government, we the people and the states retain every other power that's not specifically granted the federal government in the Constitution. I know that sounds crazy today because in Washington, in this Congress, and in this White House certainly, we are so far away from the limited powers that were intended for the federal government. But this means that the states or local governments do have the constitutional authority and the freedom to make law like that proposed by the administration, by Democrats in Washington that we're discussing today, but not the federal government. So how does this square with Democrat efforts to control the employment decisions, the employment status, the business decisions, and frankly, the life decisions of Americans? This government knows best. This government one size fits all. This government control. Fact is, President Biden doesn't understand, or worse yet, doesn't care that not everybody wants to be part of a union. Not everybody wants to join a union. American people are voting with their feet, where you've got less than 10% of Americans now that have chosen to be part of a union. A report from Credit Summit found that of the roughly 73 million American independent contractors, only 9% would prefer to have a traditional job compared to the 79% who they would prefer freelancing. That's because independent contractors have flexibility to choose their own hours and their own clients or customers. They have control of their careers. They like that. Instead of the polar opposite, being forced into paying union dues and having a union boss determine their hours and their benefits. The Biden administration rule would create unnecessary confusion at best. The Trump administration rule, on the other hand, was that the Trump administration rule that this regulation overturns is already working for independent contractors. Trump instituted a simple two-part test to determine if someone is an employee. But the Biden administration's new rule lists 6 factors to determine if someone's under the control of an employer. But of course, it doesn't stop there. The rule says that there's other factors that could be used without explaining, of course, what those might be. In other words, they would be subject to the whims of nameless, faceless, clueless bureaucrats in Washington who want to decide for the American people. Once again, however, Republicans in Congress are stepping up to the plate to protect workers and small businesses from the harm of big government. I hope my colleagues will join me in supporting this bill to protect independent contractors, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Good. Mr. Moran, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Proudly, I support H.J. Resolution 116, which seeks to rescind the final independent contractor rule recently released by the Department of Labor. This new Biden administration rule abandons the Trump-era rule and longstanding legal precedent, frankly, and replaces it with a confusing and vague rule that could lead to fewer individuals pursuing independent businesses and the opportunities that they bring. The independent contracting model benefits workers and job creators by reducing barriers to entry and allows workers to reap the benefits of their own hard work, efficiency, and innovation. Independent contracting plays a crucial role in the American economy, offering individuals the chance to pursue financial independence and the American dream, the chance to use their own skills and that hard work to climb the ladder of success. A report from Credit Summit found that roughly 73 million American independent contractors, only 9% would prefer to have a traditional job compared to 79% of them who prefer freelancing, a statistic that's been cited here today already. Unfortunately, Biden's new rule works against the independent contractor workforce by placing the authority to define an independent contractor in the hands of bureaucrats. By imposing stricter criteria for independent contractor classification, the administration's rule will hinder an individual's ability to operate as a self-employed contractor, limit job opportunities, and stifle economic growth. Instead of supporting small businesses and self-employed workers, this rule would hurt our current and future workforce. HJ Resolution 116 rescinds the Biden administration's dangerous anti-growth contractor rule. Workers, employers, and consumers have long benefited from independent work. From realtors, truckers, financial advisors, barbers, and salon workers, to name just a few. And I'll tell you, I've heard from a lot of them leading up to today's hearing. If the new independent contractor rule promulgated by the Department of Labor goes unchecked, the ability of these individuals in these professions and so many more to self-determine and control their own futures will be crushed and will ultimately be turned over to large corporations, big labor, and government bureaucrats. This is simply unacceptable. So thank you to Congressman Kiley and Chairwoman Fox for your leadership on this important issue. I fully support Resolution 116 and urge my colleagues to do the same. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Moran. There being no further discussion, Mr. Owens, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I just want to leave a couple words. I'd like to strike the last word.
You're recognized.
Weekly, as I go back and forth to the airport and all the other travels do across the country, I have that moment of being thankful when I'm picked up by a Lyft or Uber driver. I think about the technology, the opportunities for these men and women to decide on their own what time of the day, how much time they want to work to build their dreams. I think about that years and years ago, if I had had only an opportunity to do the same. When I had a downturn, if I just needed just an opportunity to have my own business on the side when I could dictate what I wanted to get done, and I didn't have it at the time. We now have so many opportunities for people to do what they dream to do, to build their life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, which is to have their own business in the way they want to have it built. And we have the unions, once again, that want to force them to work for an employee. Believe me, when this concept of the unions, this is not for the good of those who are trying to build their dreams. It's for the union coffers. I have so much respect for the independent contractor. I was one for 20-plus years, as I actually had another job too. We need to make sure we're fighting for those folks who want to build their dreams in a way that they want to build it without having to give dues to the union bosses. And I support the Res 116 in that regard. Let's let American people build their dreams the way they want to. With that, I'll go back.
Thank you, Mr. Owens. There being no further discussion on the resolution, the committee will move to consideration of amendments. There being no amendments, the question now occurs on the resolution HJ Res 116. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the resolution is agreed to. Mr. Scott, you recognize.
Ask for a recorded vote.
The ranking member requests a recorded vote, and the request will be rolled to the end of the till the end of the meeting. We'll now move to consider the next bill. The committee will now proceed to the consideration of the bill H.R. 6418 for amendment. The bill was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 6418, a bill to modify the program of grants to support high-quality charter schools.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point, and any amendment offered shall be considered as read. Does anyone wish to be recognized? Ms. Letlow, for what purpose do you seek recognition?
Madam Chairwoman, I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute for H.R. 6418.
The clerk shall designate the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6418 offered by Ms. Letlow of Louisiana, identifier ANS_01.
Without objection, the amendment shall be considered original text for purposes of further amendment. The amendment in the nature of a substitute has already been distributed. I now recognize Congresswoman Letlow for 5 minutes to explain the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Thank you, Dr. Fox. I'm proud to offer this ANS for H.R. 6418, the Empower Charter School Educators to Lead Act. I am a strong supporter of charter schools and the charter schools program known as the CSP at the U.S. Department of Education. Last year, the Louisiana Department of Education was awarded a $55.5 million CSP grant to support Louisiana's charter school movement over 5 years. This grant will transform educational opportunities for students by adding over 5,000 seats at 25 new, expanding, or replicating charters primarily located in failing school districts, including in rural areas within my congressional district. I am thrilled about this grant for Louisiana and hope other states can grow charter school options for their students. As I've toured charter schools within Louisiana and visited with advocates across the country, it's been increasingly clear how difficult, lengthy, and complex the administrative process is for starting new charters. Now, I believe there should be high standards for new charters, as these schools are shaping our future leaders. However, the process should not be overly burdensome to the point where it discourages prospective charter applications and squashes innovative approaches to education. We should provide experienced educators with the tools they need to tackle the application process. To address these concerns, last November, I introduced H.R. 6418, which is a bipartisan bill. My bill authorizes states who receive grants through the CSP to use a modest portion of their funding to support the completing the application process and development of new charter schools. These planning awards will help support educators with at least 54 months of school-based experience through the charter school application process. Applicants must have completed the development of an initial plan for opening a public charter school and have demonstrated leadership expertise and success with students. These small planning grants will give opportunities for future applicants to visit other successful charter school models so they can further learn about operations and administration, thereby strengthening their own applications and producing stronger charter schools. Additionally, the bill increases the percentage of grant funds state entities may use for state technical assistance from 7% to 10%. This could include helping applicants locate and access the facility for their new school, which is often a significant hurdle for new charters. Let me be clear, H.R. 6418 does not create a new program or new spending. This bill simply gives states the option to increase the percentage of existing funds that can be used at the state level to aid prospective charter applicants. I thank the committee for considering this bill. I believe this measure is just another vehicle through which parents can have choices for their children, and I urge my colleagues to support it so our nation's students can have expanded and educational opportunities to succeed. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Letlow. Mr. Scott, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, the purposes of the Charter Schools Program include supporting innovation, providing financial assistance for planning, design, and initial implementation of charter schools, increasing the number of high-quality charter schools, encouraging states to provide charter school facilities financing, and strengthening the charter school authorization process. Under current law, state entities are required to use at least 90% of the federal funds they receive under this program for subgrants to help eligible participants prepare for the operation of a new charter school, open the charter school, or replicate or expand existing high-quality charter schools. Thus, planning grants already exist under current law. And also under current law, to be eligible to receive that subgrant, the developer must have actually applied to a charter school authorizer to open the charter school. The developer does not have to already been approved, but once the funds are received, the grantee may use up to 18 months for planning purposes. Even under current law, there's no guarantee that a proposed charter school that receives a subgrant will actually open, but at the very least, the developer is working with the charter authorizer, an entity charged with determining which charter schools can open, establishing both operational and academic expectations, overseeing a charter school's performance, and determining which charter agreements will renew and which charter schools should close. This bill will remove even those basic requirements, expanding funds to pre-planning grants prior to an application without any guardrails. This bill creates further lack of transparency and accountability and greater potential for waste, fraud, and abuse in the charter school system. This bill would also increase the amount of funding that states can use for technical assistance by reducing the percentage of funding required to be used to plan and open new charter schools by developers that have applied to a charter school authorizer and replicate and expand existing high-quality charter schools from 90% to 82%, thus diverting funds from developers further along in the process, as well as actual students in schools. Finally, additional revenues for pre-planning grants for potential charter schools are not a wise investment of the use of federal education funding. According to the U.S. Department of Education, the demand for charter schools program funding to open and expand charter schools has declined in recent years, so much so that awards have been reduced due to the inability of grantees to meet their original targets. Now the majority might say that there's been an increase in charter school enrollments since COVID-19 pandemic, but much of that has been attributable to virtual charter schools, which the Washington Post has labeled, quote, the worst performing schools in the charter sector, unquote, and which data show that they have far worse academic outcomes and greater likelihood of financial risk than other public schools. This is simply another effort of the majority to expand school choice with no efforts to protect our federal investments instead of improving the traditional public schools. So I urge my colleagues to oppose the bill. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. Mr. Kiley, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I am strongly supportive of this bill, the Empower Charter School Educators to Lead Act. We have been fighting against attempts by this administration to cut grants for charter schools. And also, we're seeing in states like California, they're making it harder to open charters. And indeed, just this week, LA Unified, the second largest school district in the country, voted to restrict charters from being able to operate at different school sites. And it's bewildering in a sense because charters have such a tremendous track record. And so this is a bill that says we're actually going to support those who want to start and operate high quality charter schools. And the reason that charters have such a great track record in terms of closing achievement gaps, in terms of propelling student achievement, it's no accident. There are a few features of the charter school of charter schools that have propelled their success. First of all, contrary to what you sometimes hear, charters are public schools. They're free. They're open to all. They must accept all students. If there's more students who want to go there than there are seats, then they have to do a lottery, which is why many have very long waiting lists. But there are a couple ways in which they differ from traditional public schools. First of all, unlike a traditional neighborhood school, they don't get students assigned to them automatically based upon their zip code. Rather, they have to attract students to want to go there, families to want to go there, by offering a desirable educational experience. But secondly, charters really flip the traditional paradigm by which much of the public school system operates, where you often have very strict controls over the inputs of education, where you have large state bureaucracies that tell districts and school leaders exactly how they have to run their schools, have very strict regulations as far as what happens in the classroom. But then there's no concern about the outputs, that is to say, whether students are actually learning. There's no accountability for the results of what happens in the classroom. So charters flip that paradigm. They say, we're not going to regulate each and every input. We're not going to tell you exactly how to run your school and run your classroom, but what we are going to do is hold you accountable for the results and make sure that students are actually learning. And the mechanism of accountability, of course, is number one, you have to, as I said before, attract students to want to go there. And number two, your charter has to be reauthorized periodically, and the authorizer will look at whether students are actually learning and the levels of student achievement when making that decision. So this is why charters have proven to be tremendously successful, number one, in providing an alternative in districts where the public schools are failing, but number two, even in really good public school districts, providing options for families in order to find a school that is the right fit for their child and is most conducive with their success. So this is a great bill that will provide some support at a time when we're not seeing nearly enough support for the charter school movement, which has really been one of the most positive things that's happened in public education in this country in recent decades. So I thank the author, Ms. Letlow, for bringing it forward, and I yield back to the chair.
Thank you, Mr. Kiley. Ms. Bonamici, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm speaking in opposition to this bill, and I want to note that I do not question the intent of the bill's bipartisan co-sponsors, but this bill would funnel taxpayer dollars into the development of charter schools that do not yet exist and may never come to fruition without meaningful transparency or accountability provisions. But the problems in our education system are not caused by a lack of schools. They're caused by a lack of appropriate and adequate support for the schools we currently have. And if our shared goal is to create the best educational opportunities for all students, let's focus on grant programs that fund evidence-based innovation and improvement in our traditional public schools that serve all students, not ambiguous pre-planning grants for prospective developers who have not yet even received a charter. My Republican colleagues have cited charter school enrollment increases as justification for this unprecedented expansion of the law. I question how much of this growth in enrollment can be attributed to virtual and online charter schools, which have consistently shown abysmal academic outcomes for their students. It's my understanding there may be an amendment to address this issue, and I hope there is, and I hope it passes. I hope the amendment passes, not the bill. I do support the broader goal of giving families a voice in their children's educational experiences. Magnet schools, for example, that I've spoken about frequently in this committee, can be a highly effective alternative for some students. The district in which I live, the school district offers a arts magnet, science magnet, international school magnet. My daughter chose to attend one of those, and I fully supported that. But funneling taxpayer money into untested, undeveloped ideas for charter schools, instead of investing in the longstanding traditional public schools that serve the vast majority of our nation's students, is not how we should be spending our time and our money. I encourage the majority to hold future hearings and markups on bills that would strengthen our system of public education, such as the Rebuild America's Schools Act, the American Teacher Act, the IDEA Full Funding Act, My Arts Education for All Act, or the Safe Schools Improvement Act, and reject this bill instead. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Bonamici. Is there anyone else who wishes to speak on the amendment in the nature of a substitute? There being no further discussion on the amendment in the nature of a substitute, the committee will move to consideration of amendments. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Michigan seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6418 offered by Ms. Stevens of Michigan. Identifier virtual_01.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. State entities receive federal funding under the charter school program authorized by ESEA to provide funds to eligible entities to support the development, implementation, and replication of high-quality charter schools, as well as to provide technical assistance to carry out the state's charter school program. Despite the fact that planning grants are permitted under current law for developers that have applied to a charter authorizer to open a charter school, this bill significantly expands current law, and it doesn't require developers or entities supporting the developer to have applied to a charter authorizer to open a charter school. The role of charter authorizers is an important one. Charter authorizers determine which charter schools can open, establish both operational and academic expectations, oversee a charter school's performance, and determine which charter agreements to renew and which charter schools should close. I'm old enough to remember sitting in this very committee with a former Secretary of Education who was dramatically seeking to squeeze out public schools and promote failing charter schools and wouldn't admit it. A colleague on the other side of the aisle here just declared that charter schools are public schools. The reason why we need to support and invest and continue to grow our public school system here in the United States of America is that not every student has the same experience at home. And so what happens is if you don't have a parent who is advocating for you or holding your hand to get you into that charter school, the school bus picks you up in the morning to take you to the public school. So to sit here and to throw up our arms and say, well, the public schools are failing and we've got to do charters and those might fail, but we're not going to have oversight. And by the way, forget the teachers' unions and the people who are credentialed and certified, and let's just have a race to the bottom. It doesn't work. Look at my home state of Michigan, for the love of God. You know, we've dealt with this for the last 15, 20 years. We went from having the best public school system that was totally disinvested in, and now we're just still climbing our way out. And the charter system didn't work. So yeah, I'm going to get technical here about this bill and what this means for this country and the people who I'm so proud to represent. Low bars here. My amendment's going to attempt to place some guardrails on taxpayer dollars, by the way. Taxpayer dollars that are siphoning out of the public schools. We know that virtual charter schools aren't doing a good job. And sorry to raise my voice, Madam Chair, but I just feel this in my bones with these inequities that are going on. And I really disagree with this approach for what it means for Michigan. I have talked to some of the authorizers and the writers of this current piece of legislation, but an amendment that's going to adhere to what the GAO report found, that virtual charter schools had significantly lower proficiency rates on state tests compared to other school types. You know, we need to make sure we have these guardrails in place. Post increased financial risks. Again, our taxpayer dollars. I think this is something my colleagues on the other side of the aisle could agree to, and I urge the passage of my amendment. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. I appreciate my colleague's amendment, but we're not here to reevaluate all state entity grants under the Charter School Program, CSP. As drafted, this amendment would apply to the existing state entity CSP grants, not just the new authority to create a pre-planning grant. If our colleagues on the other side of the aisle would like to consider the route of virtual charter schools in the CSP, we're happy to have that discussion. Consider the role of virtual charter schools in the CSP. However, this bill is narrowly focused on creating more flexibility for states with pre-planning grants, and that's where our focus should be during this markup. I urge my colleagues to reject this amendment and vote in favor of the underlying bill. Does anyone else seek recognition on this amendment? If there's no further debate on the question is on the amendment by the gentlewoman from Michigan. All in favor say aye. All opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it and the amendment is not agreed to. A roll call vote is requested. A roll call vote is ordered. Pursuant to the chair's previous announcement, this vote will be postponed.
Amendment.
Your amendment. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk, Scott Ashore 01.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6418 offered by Mr. Scott of Virginia. Identifier ASSUR_01.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, my amendment would require the initial plan completed by a developer to include an assessment of segregation in the community in which the proposed charter school will be located, a strategy for how the proposed charter school will effectively address desegregation in the community, and an assurance that the strategy will be carried out. The Civil Rights Project, first found in 2003, the charter schools were more segregated than traditional public schools, finding that were confirmed again in 2010 and 2024. According to the 2024 report, segregation in suburban charter schools is increasing such that in 2019, approximately 27% of suburban charter schools are comprised of 90 to 100% Black and Latino students. The new charter schools located in suburbs in the top 25 metro areas, students of color were disproportionately represented. Segregation of Asian students also increased. Moreover, many charter schools were segregated by more than one factor, such as race, socioeconomic status, class, and English language learners. Studies also show that America's public schools are more segregated today than at any time since the late 1960s. Segregation of students by race and income has dramatically increased over the last 2 decades. In fact, the share of K through 12 public schools that were high poverty and comprised of mostly Black and Hispanic students nearly doubled between 2000 and 2013. Segregated schools mean segregated opportunities. Meanwhile, desegregation has proven to close achievement gaps and produce lifelong benefits by providing students of color access to the same resources as white students, and also prepare students to work in a diverse work environment. The most rigorous report to date on school integration showed that Black students who attended desegregated schools throughout their K through 12 career were more likely to graduate from high school, attend college, and attend a more selective college and complete college. The benefits were not merely limited to academics. Just 5 years after attending court-ordered desegregated schools, Black workers' earnings were found to be significantly increased, and their likelihood of experiencing poverty was significantly reduced. Charter schools are public schools funded by taxpayer dollars. school desegregation brings us one step closer to fulfilling the promise of Brown v. Board of Education, and the federal government should support desegregation efforts in all of its public schools, including charter schools. So I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. I appreciate my colleague's amendment. We can all appreciate the evils of legally mandated segregation. However, I'm afraid this amendment fundamentally misunderstands charter schools and the purpose of the pre-planning grant. First of all federal charter school program CSP grants are already covered by federal civil rights requirements. Under the statute, state entities that receive CSP grants must already work with charter schools on recruitment and enrollment practices that promote inclusion of all students and ensure that charter schools receiving CSP funds meet the educational needs of their students. Second, charter schools cannot hand select their students. They must take the students who apply, and if more students apply than there are available seats, the charter school must hold a lottery. Decreased racial diversity due to parent choice is fundamentally different than a law which mandates segregation. If minority parents choose a public charter school that will best serve their family, racial diversity in a given school may increase or decrease. But that's not an example of legally mandated segregation. Instead, it's an example of parents, regardless of their race, exercising their agency, which the education bureaucracy constantly seeks to rob them of. Finally, despite my colleagues' fear about charter schools increasing segregation, it turns out that charters do better at serving disadvantaged populations than traditional public schools on average. Many charters have narrowed the achievement gap between black and white students. About 7% of charter schools even reverse the achievement gap, with black students performing equal to or better than their white peers. According to the Stanford University study, students in poverty achieve an additional 23 days of learning in reading and 17 days in math. In urban charter schools, the students gain an additional 29 days of growth per year in reading and 28 additional days in math. Adding this requirement to a pre-planning grant when the school does not even exist would add unnecessary red tape and do nothing to help students who are desperate for educational options. I urge my colleagues to reject the amendment and vote in favor of the underlying bill.
Madam Chair?
Ms. Bonamici, you're recognized
I wish to
for
speak
5 minutes.
in support of the amendment.
You're recognized.
Thank you. I support Ranking Member Scott's amendment, and I yield time to Ranking Member Scott.
Thank you. I appreciate the gentlelady yielding. Madam Chair, I just wanted to comment about your reference to a difference between legally mandated segregation and kind of freedom of choice segregation. Freedom of choice was so ineffective in dismantling segregation in the past that it was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in a Virginia case because it was so ineffective in dismantling segregation. That this amendment just requires the charter schools to have an effective plan to deal with segregation and not make it worse than in public schools. I don't think that's unreasonable, and if you allow just unlimited freedom of choice, we can go back to the New Kent County situation that the Supreme Court found was unconstitutional. I yield back to the gentlelady from Oregon.
I yield back. Thank you, Madam Chair.
There being no, does anyone else seek recognition on the amendment? The question is on the amendment by the gentleman from Virginia. All in favor say aye. All opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it and the amendment is not agreed to. Mr. Scott requests a recorded vote. Pursuant to the chair's previous announcement, this vote will be postponed. We'll now move to consider the next bill. The clerk will report the legislation.
H.R. 3724, Accreditation for College Excellence Act of 2023, a bill to amend the Higher Education Act of 1965 to prohibit recognized accrediting agencies and associations from requiring, encouraging, or coercing institutions of higher education to meet any political litmus test or violate any right protected by the Constitution as a condition of accreditation.
Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point, and any amendment offered shall be considered as read. Does anyone wish to be recognized?
Madam Chairman,
Mr. Owens, for what purpose do you seek recognition?
I have an amendment, nature of substitute, H.R. 3724.
The clerk shall designate the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3724 offered by Mr. Owens of Utah. Identifier ANS 3724_01.
Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any time, and any amendment offered shall be considered as read. I now recognize Congressman Owen, without objection, the amendment shall be considered original text for purposes of further amendment. The amendment in the nature of a substitute has been distributed. I now recognize Congressman Owens for 5 minutes to explain the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Thank you, Dr. Fox. I'm proud to offer this ANS for H.R. 3724, the Accreditation for College Excellence Act, the ACE Act. DEI, or Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, is a divisive administrative framework that exerts significant influence over policy, personnel, and administration's decisions in every American university. DEI is an ideological descendant of critical race theory and Marxist thought. Reminiscent of the communist regimes, DEI bureaucracies require a litmus test and loyalty oaths to gain admissions into academia's ivory towers. This pervasive, corrosive ideology seeks to undermine American exceptionalism. DEI campus activists preach a divisive and racist message that ascribes a value to group identities as perpetual power struggles rather than recognizing the self-worth, work ethic, and individual merit. The American Jewish community is but the latest group to find themselves a target of this DEI orthodoxy. Forced commitment to DEI is at odds with academic freedom. DEI administrators have the chilling effect on free speech by censoring viewpoints they deem harmful. Innovative and critical thought requires a culture that supports open discourse on a diversity of viewpoints. To counter the rampant scourge of DEI that has overtaken American universities, I introduced the ACE Act last May. This legislation prohibits accreditors from mandating DEI standards to receive accreditation. Specifically, this legislation prohibits accreditors from assessing an institution's commitment to an ideology, belief, or viewpoint for the purpose of receiving accreditation for HEA funding. Protects colleges' religious mission and its ability to acquire adherence with religious practices or codes of conduct. Ensures that accreditors cannot require, encourage, or coerce institutions to violate any right protected by the Constitution, and limits accreditors for adopting any additional standards to Title IX accreditation that are not already found in law. The standards for accreditors must remain neutral, objective, and fair, not skewed toward ideological extremes like those embedded in the DEI. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation, and I thank the committee for bringing this bill up for consideration. We must take a strong stance against the evil of DEI and the threat it poses to American universities. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Owens. Are there any members who wish to be recognized for further discussion on the amendment and the nature of a substitute? Mr. Scott, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, for decades, federally recognized accreditors have served as 1/3 of the oversight triad for U.S. higher education, along with oversight by states, federal government, and now the third is the accreditors. Accreditation is meant to be the gold standard for college quality and performance, and after all, accreditation is the gateway to billions of dollars in federal student aid each year. And as we know, the accreditation system needs significant reform to ensure that its assurance to students is real. But unfortunately, H.R. 3724 does not make those critical reforms. Rather, it is a baseless attempt to inject culture wars into the ever-important accreditation system. This is now the second proposal we've had to consider this year that harms the accreditation process. In January, this committee marked up the College Cost Reduction Act, which included this bill's harmful language. This bill adds requirements to the Higher Education Act concerning accrediting agencies' treatment of religious institutions. This proposal and the proposal we considered in the College Cost Reduction Act would essentially allow religious institutions to skirt accreditation standards for core curricular requirements. Currently, the law requires accrediting agencies to respect the mission of religious institutions, but it ensures that agencies are still able to enforce their standards fairly. H.R. 3724 also has a litmus test prohibition that would prohibit accrediting agencies from requiring, encouraging, or coercing schools to, quote, support or commit to supporting disparate treatment of any individuals or groups. This prohibition reinforces a harmful Republican narrative that DEI initiatives meant to support college success for all students are equivalent to disparate treatment. H.R. 3724 is another way the committee Republicans are making clear that a diverse and welcoming campus environment is not a priority for them. We're wasting time debating 3724, not only because it doesn't meaningfully reform accreditation, but because this committee has already passed out language equivalent to this when we considered the harmful language in the College Cost Reduction Act. This proposal before us today represents a solution in search of a problem and fundamentally seeks to undermine our accrediting system. Strongly urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment nature substitute and the underlying bill. And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. Are there any members who wish to be recognized for further discussion on the amendment and the nature of a substitute? And I will recognize myself for 5 minutes. Did you want to be recognized, Ms.? I have an amendment. Oh, sorry. Well, we're still working on the amendment and the nature of a substitute.
Go ahead.
Okay. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. I'm proud to support H.R. 3724, the Accreditation for College Excellence Act of 2023, and urge my colleagues to support this legislation today. Accreditors are one of the entities primarily responsible for evaluating a college's worthiness to receive billions of dollars in taxpayer-funded financial aid annually. Often referred to as the gatekeepers to Title IV eligibility, our whole post-secondary education system relies on accreditation agencies to provide a trustworthy stamp of academic approval on college programs. But as evidence shows, many bachelor and graduate programs are not providing a worthwhile investment and leave students worse off financially with more debt than they are earning. Nevertheless, institutions and programs typically maintain their accreditation, and student outcomes have continued to suffer. Accreditation is no guarantee against low financial value. Instead of working with colleges to bolster their academic rigor, accreditors have used their time and attention to develop diversity, equity, and inclusion standards or other ideological-based standards unrelated to academic quality and which play a divisive role on college campuses. H.R. 3724 would ensure accreditor standards do not require, encourage, or coerce an institution to support or oppose partisan viewpoints on social or political issues, and ensure that no standards require an institution to support the disparate treatment of any individual or group. No institution should be forced to adopt the social justice agenda in order to receive Title IV funding. This is opposite of academic freedom. H.R. 3724 would provide appropriate protections for religious institutions to be able to adhere to their religious tenets. Accreditors should also not be able to pile on additional standards beyond what is specifically outlined in the Higher Education Act. This takes institutions away from the core mission of developing programs that provide students academic success. This is why H.R. 3724 also closes a loophole known as the, quote, elastic clause, end quote, which currently allows accreditors to impose additional conditions on Title IV eligibility. It is troubling that accreditors have become enforcers of institutions' DEI standards, but have not made more progress in holding institutions accountable for producing workforce-ready graduates. This stops today. I thank Representative Owens for his leadership on H.R. 3724. This bill rejects ideological and partisan agendas from being embedded into post-secondary education and returns a focus on academic quality to post-secondary education. I yield back. There being no further discussion on the amendment in the nature of a substitute, the committee will move to consideration of amendments. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Oregon seek recognition?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3724 offered by Ms. Bonamici of Oregon, identifier AMD 3724_01.
The gentlewoman from Oregon is recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Within a 6-week period, this committee has taken up 2 separate pieces of legislation to address accreditation of religious institutions, proposing policies to effectively create sweeping exemptions that would allow religious institutions to skirt accreditation standards for core curricular requirements. These policies are in stark contrast to the current carefully crafted regulations that allow accrediting agencies to respect the religious mission and operation of religious institutions while still being able to enforce their standards, so the institutions or programs' curricula include all core components required by the agency. Today, the bill we're considering seeks to protect the religious mission and operations of religious institutions without including that second vital policy piece of the regulation, that's ensuring that accrediting agencies can still maintain their standards for the core curricula components. So taken together, these legislative proposals seek to undermine the accreditation process and potentially mislead students that their chosen program of study meets accreditation standards. My amendment adds a simple consumer protection disclosure requirement to require full transparency to students and faculty when any institution seeks an exemption from the core curricular component required by an accrediting agency. I want to note that the amendment is neutral. It does not target only religious institutions, and the disclosure would be required of any institution that seeks an exemption from accreditation standards. Specifically, the amendment requires institutions to provide notice and to students and prospective students any time an institution's curricular or program curricula is exempted from meeting the standards from an accrediting agency. Students have a fundamental right to know if their program of study does not meet accreditation standards. With this amendment, students will have that information so they can be informed consumers regarding their education. I also want to note, Madam Chair and colleagues, that this again appears to be another attempt to attack diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, which I just had a really good conversation with higher education officials earlier this week, and none of them mentioned that diversity, equity, inclusion were problematic at their institutions. In fact, they are helping their institutions. So I urge my colleagues to support this important consumer protection amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Bonamici. Does anyone else wish recognition on the amendment? And I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Respect for the religious mission of an institution is paramount. This has been kept in mind for policymakers when crafting appropriate requirements to recognize a religious institution's characteristic with respect to the accreditation standards. H.R. 3724 respects religious mission by maintaining that ability to allow the institution to have applicants, students, or employees provide a statement of faith and adhere to the religious code of conduct, and I applaud the bill for this reason. Accreditors must consistently apply and enforce standards among institutions, including religious mission. The law currently requires an accreditor not to use as a negative factor the institution's religious mission-based policy, decision, and practices, but provided that the institution includes core curricular components required by the accreditor. This amendment is not keenly focused on the issue in the underlying bill. This amendment would require religious institutions that seek a core curricula exemption from the accreditor to publish a description of the request and final determination by the accreditor. This is not just a simple disclosure, however. As we've seen over the years, religious institutions and their policies have been targeted. If anyone wants to see what the core curriculum of an institution is, they can go to the website and see the curriculum for themselves. There are true reasons why a religious institution might seek an exemption. For example, is sociology or psychology a core class? A religious institution may seek to have an instructor or tenets of faith applied in this course. It is unacceptable to use the power of the government through the accreditor to force the college to change the curriculum. This amendment will do more harm than good. I oppose it, and I yield back. Does anyone seek recognition on the amendment? If there's what is she saying? Oh, okay. Well, I'm going to say, okay. Since there's no further debate, the question is on the amendment by the gentlewoman from Oregon. All in favor say aye. All opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it and the amendment's not agreed to. The gentlewoman from Oregon has requested a roll call vote. A roll call vote is ordered. Pursuant to the chair's previous announcement, this vote will be postponed. We're going to take a very brief recess, subject to the call of the chair. We'll now move to consider the next bill. The committee will now proceed to consideration of the bill H.R. 7683 for amendment. The bill was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 7683, a bill to amend the Higher Education Act of 1965 to require institutions of higher education to adopt and adhere to principles of free speech and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point, and any amendment offered shall be considered as read. Does anyone seek to be recognized? Mr. Williams, for what purpose do you seek recognition?
Madam Chairwoman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Titled ANS_001. The clerk shall designate the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7683 offered by Mr. Williams of New York, identifier ANS_001.
Without objection, the amendment shall be considered original text for purposes of further amendment. The amendment in the nature of a substitute has already been distributed. I now recognize Congressman Williams for 5 minutes to explain the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I would like to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute for H.R. 7683. My Respecting the First Amendment on Campus Act. It is an amendment ANS_001, H.R. 7683 would ensure that colleges and universities are fulfilling their First Amendment obligations by making free speech on campus a condition of receiving Title IV funding under the Higher Education Act. Free speech is under attack at our colleges and universities. That is difficult for me to acknowledge. College campuses have become a breeding ground for illiberal thought, where we've seen shout-outs, shout-downs, cancellations, doxing, disciplinary action, and even physical violence in reaction to speech dissenting from left-wing orthodoxy. Institutions are leveraging taxpayers' dollars to fan these flames of illiberalism that history will teach us tore apart China under Chairman Mao. But today, for too many universities, censorship is permitted, encouraged even, as long as it's done under the guise of supporting diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI. The forced commitment to DEI has been rampant on college campuses, often at the expense of free expression and discourse. Political litmus tests in admissions and in hiring practices penalize applicants for not conforming or committing to the correct beliefs of the day. If an applicant is able to submit a DEI statement that meets the standards of an institution and thus passes the political litmus test, he or she is often subject to the whims of DEI thought police administrators who use the cynical and Orwellian bludgeons of harm reduction and safety to enforce their ideological wills. Meanwhile, in certain public colleges and universities, these DEI officers are bankrolled with salaries as high as $300,000. Today, many students who are silenced feel like there is no hope. This committee is standing up for them. By passing the Respecting the First Amendment on Campus Act and offering true commitment to diversity of thought, we can uphold Americans' constitutional rights, even on college campuses, and help to restore decency on campus. Specifically, this bill affirms the First Amendment protections public campuses must provide by making them a condition of receiving Title IV funds under the HEA. This ensures students are educated on their First Amendment rights. It safeguards the freedoms of association and religion on campus, which are now under attack. It prohibits institutions from forcing students, faculty, or applicants to take political litmus tests and requires all institutions to disclose annually their First Amendment policies. The First Amendment is non-negotiable. It was established precisely to protect speech critical of the government or of the established ideological orthodoxy of the time. This legislation ensures post-secondary students are taught in an environment that upholds the First Amendment as they become responsible citizens of American society. And I will close by just bringing up the teaching of Alexander Solzhenitsyn and the experience in Soviet Russia following the revolution under Lenin and under Stalin that went after exactly these kinds of rules and conformity of thought with the full force of institutions. This is exactly why we're standing up and why this amendment matters today. Madam Chairwoman, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. I recognize Ranking Member Scott for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, the First Amendment protects some of the most deeply cherished rights we have as Americans. The ANS and the underlying bill attempt to essentially codify the First Amendment here, but only as it relates to public colleges that participate in Title IV funding, and so this is totally unnecessary. Any student who currently believes that his First Amendment rights are being violated can already bring a federal case against a public college or university, and students have been doing so for over 200 years. And precedent and case law has been carefully defined and determined about how First Amendment is to be interpreted and enforced in those situations. That includes precedents that specifically talk about the unique nature of colleges and universities as public entities that both must uphold constitutional rights and provide students with a safe learning environment that entitles them to be protected from a hostile environment, and so that any entity that receives federal assistance is subject to those kinds of limitations. The court rules in favor of the student, the school must stop its actions. But with this bill today, the majority would have us throw out those centuries of case law and replace it with a hastily drafted statute that, according to one press release, purports to, quote, remove barriers that limit constitutional rights. Now, Madam Chair, a statute cannot remove barriers that limit constitutional rights any more than a statute can limit constitutional rights. What the bill actually does is make public colleges and universities who could be acting in good faith, attempting to protect the safety and security of everyone present on their campus, subject to monetary judgments and potential loss of Title IV aid. In so doing, the proponents of limited government are micromanaging how colleges and universities handle their internal process of governance. So under the proposed bill, if a student wants to form a chapter of the Proud Boys on campus and couldn't find a faculty sponsor, the school would have to provide them with a pathway to become an official organization or be subject to losing Title IV aid. Now, if that now recognized Proud Boys student organization group wanted to receive a portion of the student activity fee funding to conduct their activities, the school would have to provide that funding or subject themselves to a lawsuit that could end up with them losing Title IV aid. And if the Proud Boys wanted to bring one of their national leaders to campus in an act that safety and security officials determined could result in a tremendous pushback and counter-protest, if they factored that into the consideration of what size security fee to charge, that could potentially jeopardize their Title IV aid in addition. Aside from being essentially an affirmative action plan for Proud Boys, the bill will have the serious implications of how schools deal with freedom of speech on campus. By requiring schools to allow all individuals unfettered free speech rights anywhere that is generally accessible, we will limit the ability to protect the use of property on the campus community and make it likely that institutions will become greater targets for outsiders who seek to disrupt learning environments. While the bill may envision ensuring free debate on campus, public institutions own and maintain an incredible diversity of property that includes hospitals, athletic fields, parking lots, residence halls, even forests, many of which are, quote, generally accessible. Public land-grant institutions have extensive services and land often owned by the school that is also generally accessible. This bill's definition of expressive activity attempts to mirror what is currently allowed under the First Amendment. But as I've mentioned, this is not an addendum to the First Amendment. This is not a constitutional amendment. This is a law designed to create new avenues to punish institutions of higher education. H.R. 7683 also includes a provision called the Equal Campus Access, which would prohibit Title IV funding to public colleges and universities that refuse to recognize or provide benefits, such as funding, to religious student groups because of the group's religious beliefs, practices, speech, leadership standards, or standards of conduct. This provision has the effect of creating an exemption to the school's non-discrimination policies by requiring schools to recognize and fund these student groups that discriminate against other students. So an LGBTQ group could be, a LGBTQ student could be forced to help through student fees, to give part of the student fees to an entity that could be discriminating against them from joining the group. This is just a small list of multiple problems with the ENS and the underlying bill, and as such, I would hope that we would defeat the legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Kiley, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This legislation includes a measure that I introduced called the Free Speech on Campus Act, which is a measure that I hope can receive strong bipartisan support from this committee. I originally developed this measure with someone who's pretty far out on the other end of the political spectrum, and that is the Dean of UC Berkeley Law School, Erwin Chemerinsky. But we were able to agree on the foundational importance of freedom of speech and how very troubling it is that our universities have deviated so far from this principle, which is sort of a core tenet of classical liberalism, not to mention our Constitution and our entire system of government. So the idea behind this measure is that in order to restore the proper place of freedom of speech in higher education, we need to make sure that from a legal perspective, universities aren't violating First Amendment rights, but we also need to change the culture on college campuses. And one way to do that is to make up for a shortcoming of our K-12 education system, and that is to teach students about what the First Amendment is, why it is important, the role it plays in our form of government, why it is that if you disagree with an idea, that doesn't mean you should try to silence the idea, and the history of how the First Amendment and free expression has propelled social progress, protected the rights of minorities throughout American history. And so this provision would say that when you go to orientation, when you arrive on campus your first year, and you're being educated about your different rights and responsibilities on campus, that learning about the First Amendment, its purpose, and its history is part of that orientation. And this was endorsed by the editorial board of the LA Times in an editorial titled How to Protect Free Speech on College Campuses. The editorial board wrote, "It should be unnecessary to remind students that universities are places where controversial, even offensive ideas must be tolerated. Free expression and robust debate are indispensable to the academic mission. But commentators from across the political spectrum have remarked on the fact that many members of this generation of college students are skeptical of the idea of uninhibited free speech." The editorial continues, "There should be no Democratic versus Republican divide on whether universities should be bastions of free speech." So I would encourage support for this proposal. We might disagree, often fiercely, about different ideas on different topics, but we should be able to agree on the value of ideas themselves, especially at the place where they're most vital, and that is our institutions of higher learning. Thank you, and I yield back to the chair.
Mr. Kiley yields back. Ms. Bonamici, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized.
Thank you. I certainly support free speech, including free speech on college campuses, but I oppose this legislation. I align myself with Ranking Member Scott's concerns. Earlier this week, I spoke with several college presidents and higher education leaders in Oregon. We had a good conversation. about the challenges and opportunities in higher education. How many of them asked for a 32-page bill that's ostensibly about free speech rights, but is in fact micromanaging institutions by adding a complicated compliance regime and continuing the attack on diversity, equity, and inclusion? Not one. What did they want? More funding for Pell Grants, work-study reform, policies that make higher education more affordable, especially for first-generation and low-income students. I'm especially concerned about the section in this bill that states that public and private institutions of higher education should adopt some version of the Chicago principles. Those principles may work for Chicago, but we should not push this top-down on all institutions. In fact, this bill would actually insert more politics into higher education, and it risks losing important Title IV-A resources, which would harm students most in need. Now, I know Mr. Kiley has left, but I respect Dean Chemerinsky, and I also support civics education. But I have to say that this bill is the wrong approach. I urge opposition, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields back. Ms. Houchin, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to speak in favor of the amendment in the nature of a substitute for H.R. 7683, respecting the First Amendment on College Campus Act, which includes my Students' Bill of Rights legislation aimed at safeguarding the fundamental right to free speech on college campuses nationwide. And it addresses the erosion of the First Amendment rights faced by students by ensuring all voices are represented in the academic community. Included in this text are my provisions on ensuring that alternative options for a group's recognition are available. Unfortunately, on many of our college campuses, conservative groups are sometimes not able to organize for lack of a sponsor on campus. In these cases, students should be able to name a sponsor to work with the university leadership, allowing them to organize and meet. In addition, the legislation mandates that institutions publicly disclose their process for distributing funding to student clubs. Unfortunately, while schools collect student fees, they don't always fairly distribute these fees to student programs in an ideologically balanced way. Similarly, groups shouldn't be charged higher security fees necessarily simply based on ideology. As such, the bill requires institutions to publicly disclose their security fee structure and charge security fees in a viewpoint-neutral manner when possible. Finally, the bill mandates that institutions disclose their policies regarding protections for campus speakers and implements disciplinary measures for students who threaten speaker safety. I want to thank the Alliance Defending Freedom, the America First Policy Institute, Heritage Action, and the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education for endorsing the Students' Bill of Rights. I'd also like to thank Senator Ernst for agreeing to introduce the Senate version of the Students' Bill of Rights in the coming weeks. Sometimes my colleagues on the other side of the aisle tend to use the most extreme examples as if they are the norm to try to hide the efforts of the extreme left to censor and silence conservative speech. This ignores the many conservative students who only wish to have a group of like-minded students to promote and pursue their values without being silenced or prohibited from free expression. And that should go both ways. I thank Chairwoman Fox and Representative Williams for including this important part of this legislation as part of the Higher Education Act for its reauthorization this Congress, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Houchin. Ms. Manning, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
I am glad this committee is investigating the frightening rise of anti-Semitism on college campuses and recently held a roundtable with Jewish students from 9 different universities who spoke out movingly about their shocking experiences. And I hope this committee will continue to take steps to address the issues those students raised. I believe all students deserve to feel safe and welcomed on college campuses, and I believe that campus administrators are responsible for ensuring that safety. However, the majority now brings us the Respecting the First Amendment on Campus Act, and there are myriad issues with this bill, which my colleagues and I have and will continue to raise, but I want to talk on a few. I'll start with the bill's sense of Congress, in which it calls for the adoption of the Chicago principles of free speech by which colleges and universities call for the free expression of ideas, which of course is important, but the principles go on to say that institutions should not take clear positions on issues in the name of promoting free speech. So how can we promote that while at the same time, just months ago, we were grilling the professors of Penn and Harvard and MIT about their institutions' failure to condemn Hamas and condemn the use of the phrase "from the river to the sea"? We all expressed concerns about how long it took Harvard to clearly condemn Hamas, as we should have. So how can we demand universities take a stand against the hateful, humiliating, isolating anti-Semitism that we condemned, while also considering legislation that would prevent them from doing so? This bill, I'm afraid, could actually protect the kind of extreme hate speech and rhetoric that we condemned at that now infamous hearing. For example, as written, the bill could prevent a college from suspending a neo-Nazi club on campus or a chapter of Students for Justice in Palestine which openly offers support for Hamas. This bill could allow schools to recognize the club, providing them funding, and appoint a school-sanctioned faculty advisor, legitimizing their hate speech. Finally, this bill creates more administrative bureaucracy in all the wrong places. While my colleagues on this committee have frequently discussed administrative bloat in colleges, this bill creates more bureaucracy, from requiring the creation of several sets of new guidelines to the development of educational programming on free speech. Meanwhile, many students continue to be unaware of their rights under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. That is exactly what we should be highlighting for students at their orientation. All in all, I'm disappointed that this committee is not doing more to act on the disturbing stories that we have heard from students across the country about the real problems they're facing on campuses. After the hearing that we had, blasting colleges for failing to act to protect students against the normalization of hateful language that isolates, humiliates, and demeans Jewish students, I'm baffled about why we're considering a ham-handed bill that would prevent schools from taking the very actions we excoriated them for failing to take. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. Mr. Walberg, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I rise in support of H.R. 7683, the Respecting the First Amendment on Campus Act, and to uphold Americans' constitutional liberties for college students and faculty. Free speech is under attack at colleges and universities. Shoutdowns, disciplinary action, and even physical violence in reaction to speech are pervasive on college campuses. Students and faculty should never fear for their safety and livelihoods for expressing differing opinions. If we're to remain a tolerant society, accepting of diversity of ideas, then colleges need to remain an open arena for thoughtful debate, discussion, and most importantly, faith. That is why I'm particularly pleased that the bill contains text from my bill, the Equal Campus Access Act, which would clarify that no funds shall be made available to a public institution that denies a religious student group any right similarly afforded to other organizations because of the religious group's beliefs, practices, or leadership standards. Over the past few years, we've seen a concerning increase of incidents on college campuses where religious student organizations have lost rights, benefits, and privileges due to faith-based practices. These incidents led to the Trump administration to issue its free inquiry on college campus rule to protect student and religious organizations' rights to exercise their religious beliefs. Given everything we have witnessed on college campuses since October 7, it's unconscionable that the Biden administration is seeking to undo this rule and open the door for further faith-based discrimination. Students should not have to give up their First Amendment rights of speech, religion, and association to attend a public college. I encourage my colleagues to support H.R. 7683, and we hope we can take this bill up in the full House as quickly as possible. And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Wahlberg. Ms. McBath, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Fox. I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I appreciate the chair's concerns about the First Amendment, the freedom of speech, and the freedom of association, and I thank her for hosting today's markup. But if you talk to parents with students or kids that are about to head off to college, there's another very pressing issue on our college campuses that has reached crisis level, and I want to kind of really touch upon that today because there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of discussion about it, and this is the crisis of collegiate bullying and hazing. The fact of the matter is that students are being seriously hurt on our campuses and college institutions every single day. They're being hurt both emotionally and physically, and they're even being killed by instances of hazing. A time that should be filled with celebration and exciting new beginnings instead turns into a parent's worst nightmare and a sibling's greatest fear to come true. I know because I've been on that receiving end of getting that phone call, the call that changes everything in a moment's notice. It makes you feel like your whole world is crashing down as a parent. I know what it's like to lose a child. I lost my son, Jordan, so I know the pain of not being able to see my son attend a college campus or being able to attend his college graduation or even being able to walk him down the aisle for his wedding. It's what drives me every single day here in Congress and before this committee on behalf of the many incredible families that I've had the pleasure of fighting for and fighting alongside on this very important issue during my time here in Congress. Families like the Diversleys, who lost their son, Gary, lost him in 2007 to hazing, or Steve and Ray Ann Groover, who lost Max, or the Piazzas and their son, Tim. These tragedies have ripped these families apart. Ripped them apart in my district in Georgia, and I know it's also impacted many of the members in this room who've also had these kinds of tragedies with their own constituencies as well. So I appreciate all the work that we've done on this issue and the support that's been provided by fellow committee members for these very bipartisan efforts. But we simply cannot continue to wait while students suffer. How many more students are we going to lose to hazing? And how long are we going to continue to turn a blind eye to hazing? The price of inaction is simply too high. We talk about what's happening on our college campuses, what even happened just recently in Georgia to a young student. So if we're going to talk about safety, if we're going to talk about protecting our students and giving them every opportunity to be viable and successful on our college campuses and these institutions, then we need to talk about hazing. I thank the chair and her staff for this work today. And I hope that we can also take time with this Congress to consider the bipartisan Stop Campus Hazing Act as well. It is long past time, and we cannot afford to lose any more of our children. They demand our attention. They deserve our ability to keep them safe and secure so that they too can live the American dream. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back. Is there any other member who wishes to be recognized on the amendment in the nature of a substitute? I will recognize myself for 5 minutes. The first thing I want to say is that I think all of us are aware of and empathize tremendously with parents like Congresswoman McBath who have lost their children through acts of violence on campus. We've all had our attention raised lately about the case in Georgia. So I want people to understand we're extremely sympathetic with that. But I think what we have to do on this piece of legislation is correct the record. We need to make sure that we characterize what this legislation does and does not do. First, the provisions in the bill do not alter the required First Amendment protections that public institutions must meet. This bill merely requires institutions to be transparent, finally, about their specific policies and be consistent in guarding the rights of all students and faculty. Additionally, the bill does not alter an institution's obligation to safeguard students from discrimination under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. There is specific language in the bill to reaffirm that nothing in the bill infringes on these important civil rights protections. Second, once actions cross over from the line of speech to discriminatory conduct, Title VI rights must be protected. Speech that is offensive or vulgar is protected. Even hate speech, certainly abhorrent, can be protected. But let's not confuse what we're seeing on today's campuses. Testimonials from students at our recent roundtable prove that calm, peaceful speech is not what has been happening. Over the years, the courts have spoken to help us navigate carefully defined exceptions to protected speech, and that includes hate speech that causes evident harm. Speech that produces tangible harm, such as causing true threats that would incite imminent lawless action, fighting words, or intent to intimidate, is not protected. Speech and actions that turn into discriminatory conduct are not protected. As we look around campuses today and see some of the protests turn into violence, we're watching speech turn into discriminatory conduct. Today, institutions should have policies in place to protect both First Amendment and Title VI rights. Institutions that claim this bill will make it more difficult to provide free speech protections must not be aware of their First Amendment responsibilities. There being no further discussion on the amendment in the nature of a substitute, the committee will move to consideration of amendments. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from North Carolina seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7683 offered by Ms. Manning of North Carolina, identifier MANN_001.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm bringing forward this amendment to the Respecting the First Amendment on Campus Act to highlight the need for students to understand their rights on campus. Under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, if a student is attending a school that received federal funds, they cannot be discriminated against on the basis of race, nationality, ancestry, or ethnic characteristics. This includes discrimination because a student is perceived to be or is Jewish, Israeli, or any other ethnic or religious background. If a student reports discrimination to their institution and the institution fails to respond to the incident, that student has the right to bring forward a complaint directly to the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights, which can launch a Title VI investigation. When free speech crosses into outright harassment, and we heard many examples in the roundtable with Jewish students, this is a useful tool for students to protect themselves. I have met with Jewish students, I have met with Jewish on Campus, a student-led national organization that informs students of their rights when they face anti-Semitism on campus. Organizations like the ADL, the Brandeis Center, and the American Jewish Committee also provide guidance for students who wish to report instances of anti-Semitism to federal agencies. We should ensure that institutions are also offering that information. In the wake of October 7th, we know that instances of anti-Semitism on college campuses have increased like never before. And by now, we have all seen the disturbing photos of swastikas graffitied onto the walls of college campuses, or videos of protesters pounding on the doors and the windows of a building with Jewish students inside. Now more than ever, it is critical that we ensure that students know their rights. And my amendment adds a rule of construction in the bill that ensures that campus administrators have the power to revoke recognition of or funding from or outright suspend any student organization that openly supports a U.S. designated foreign terrorist organization. In November, Brandeis University made the decision to revoke its recognition of its chapter of the National Students for Justice in Palestine because of its outspoken support for Hamas, a U.S. designated terror organization. And that support was in direct violation of Brandeis's principles of free speech on campus. I'd like to submit a statement by President Ron Leibowitz of Brandeis University for the record.
Without objection.
Columbia also suspended its own chapter of SJP in November after that organization repeatedly violated university policies for campus events and engaged in threatening rhetoric and intimidation. Anti-Semitism, as we have all acknowledged on college campuses, is very real, and there is no place for student organizations that offer support for a terrorist organization that wants to eliminate Jews and wipe Israel off the face of the earth. We should all agree that supporting terrorism is a bridge too far, and this amendment would add that limited exception to the bill. Without this common sense amendment, the bill could potentially prevent colleges and universities like Brandeis, Columbia, and GW from taking action against their student groups that support terrorists and intimidate and harass Jewish students on their campuses. I encourage all of my colleagues on this committee to support this amendment, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlewoman from North Carolina for offering her amendment. Institutions need to do a better job of informing their students about their rights and protections under the law, and it's been appalling to see the way campuses have failed to do so. So I thank the gentlewoman for her interest in protecting the students and accept the amendment. Does anyone else seek recognition on the amendment?
Parliamentary inquiry, Madam Chair. How many amendments did the gentlelady from North Carolina introduce?
I'm sorry. This is Manning _001.
Did she introduce Manning 002? Not yet?
No.
Okay, thank you.
You want to do it?
Yeah, do you want a voice vote on the amendment?
On the O2.
No, one. The one we just did, we.
Okay.
It was accepted.
Here we go. All right. Okay, is there further debate on the amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment by the gentlewoman from North Carolina. All in favor say aye. Aye. In the opinion, chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment's agreed to. Oh, are there, sorry. All in favor say aye. We've said that. All opposed, no. In the opinion, chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment's agreed to. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from North Carolina seek to be recognized?
Madam Chair, I have a second amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7683 offered by Ms. Manning of North Carolina, identifier MANN_002.
The gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment _002.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move to strike the last word.
The gentlewoman's recognized.
Madam Chair, I actually spoke on both of my amendments just a few minutes ago. Let me just emphasize that this amendment would add into the bill an obligation for schools to explain the students' protection under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act and the procedures for filing a discrimination claim with the Office of Civil Rights of the Department of Education. As I mentioned just a moment ago, it is critically important that our students understand what their rights are under the Civil Rights Act, that they do not have to accept harassment, isolation, discrimination based on their ethnicity, their shared ancestry, and that includes discrimination based on their being Jewish or being perceived to be Jewish, being Israeli, or being any other religion or ethnicity. So I offer this amendment because I think it's a necessary step in making sure that our students are able to access the protection they need. I urge all of my colleagues to vote in favor of this amendment, and with that, I yield back.
Does anyone else seek recognition on the amendment? And I recognize myself. I'd like to thank the gentlelady from North Carolina for offering her amendment. I agree that institutions need to take appropriate action when student organizations use speech that is not protected under the First Amendment to harm and intimidate others. No student organization should provide material support to foreign terrorist organizations. I thank the gentlewoman and I'm happy to support the amendment. I yield back. Does anyone else seek recognition on the amendment? Wait a minute. Okay. All right. If there's no further debate, the questions on the amendment by the gentlewoman from North Carolina _002. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. In the opinion, chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Pursuant, pardon me. Debate has concluded. And the committee will be shortly in recess. The committee will reconvene for purposes of the recorded votes that were requested and postponed. The committee will return around 1:15. The committee will come to order. We'll proceed to request for roll call votes, which had been postponed. I now entertain a motion to, I now recognize Mr. Kiley. Pardon me.
Madam Chair, we voice voted HJ Res 116, and I requested a recorded vote. That technically wasn't the motion to report, so I'd like to withdraw my request for recorded vote and reserve the right to ask for a recorded vote when the motion to report is made.
Without objection, the request is withdrawn. The right to request a recorded vote on the motion to report the resolution is preserved. I now entertain a motion to report the resolution HJ Res 116 and recognize Mr. Kiley.
I move the Committee on Education and the Workforce report the resolution HJ Res 116 to the House of Representatives, and with the recommendation that the resolution be agreed to and the resolution do pass.
The question now occurs on reporting HJ Res 116 to the House with a favorable recommendation. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it and the motion is agreed to. Mr. Scott requests a recorded vote. A recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Fox.
Aye.
Ms. Fox votes aye. Mr. Wilson. Aye. Mr. Wilson votes aye. Mr. Thompson. Mr. Wahlberg. Aye. Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Grothman. Mr. Grothman votes aye. Ms. Stefanik. Mr. Allen. Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Banks. Mr. Comer. Mr. Smucker. Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Owens. Mr. Owens votes aye. Mr. Good. Mr. Good votes aye. Ms. McLean. Ms. Miller. Ms. Steele. Ms. Steele votes aye. Mr. Estes. Mr. Estes. Mr. Estes votes aye. Ms. Letlow. Mr. Kiley. Mr. Kiley votes aye. Mr. Bean. Mr. Bean votes aye. Mr. Burleson. Mr. Burleson votes aye. Mr. Moran. Mr. James. Ms. Chavez-DeRemer. Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams votes aye. Ms. Houchin. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott votes no. Mr. Grijalva. Mr. Courtney. Mr. Sablon. Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Wilson. Ms. Bonamici. Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. DeCano. Mr. DeCano votes no. Ms. Adams. Mr. DeSaulnier.
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier votes no. Mr. Norcross. Ms. Jayapal. Ms. Wild. Ms. Wild votes no. Ms. McBath. Ms. McBath votes no. Ms. Hayes. Ms. Omar. Ms. Stevens. Ms. Stevens votes no. Ms. Ledger-Fernandez. Ms. Manning. Ms. Manning votes no. Mr. Mervan. Mr. Bowman.
Would the clerk call the names of members who did not respond on the initial call?
Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson votes aye. Ms. Stefanik. Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Banks. Mr. Comer. Ms. McLean.
Yes.
Ms. McLean votes yes. Ms. Miller.
Yes.
Ms. Miller votes yes. Ms. Letlow. Mr. James. Mr. James votes aye. Mr. Moran. Ms. Chavez-DeRemer. Ms. Houchin.
How's Mr. Banks recorded?
Mr. Banks is not recorded. Mr. Banks votes yes. Mr. Grijalva. Mr. Courtney. Ms. Wilson. Ms. Adams. Ms. Adams votes no. Mr. Norcross. Ms. Jayapal. Ms. Jayapal votes no. Ms. Hayes? Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Ms. Ledger Fernandez? Mr. Mervan? Mr. Bowman?
How is Ms. Hayes recorded?
Ms. Hayes is not recorded.
Hayes votes no.
Ms. Hayes votes no.
How is Ms. Houchin recorded?
Ms. Houchin is not recorded. Ms. Houchin votes aye.
The clerk will report the tally.
Madam Chair, on this vote, there were 21 ayes and 13 nays.
The ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. H.J. Res. 116 is ordered reported to the House of Representatives. The chair notes for the record that a quorum is present. I ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes to the resolution. Without objection, so ordered. Pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L, I give notice that all members have the requisite number of days to file supplemental, minority, additional, or dissenting views. Without objection, so ordered. We'll now be voting on two amendments to the bill, H.R. 6418. First, the amendment offered by Ms. Stevens, virtual underline 01. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Fox?
No.
Ms. Fox votes no. Mr. Wilson? No. Mr. Wilson votes no. Mr. Thompson? No. Mr. Thompson votes no. Mr. Wahlberg? No. Mr. Wahlberg votes no. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes no. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes no. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes no. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes no. Mr. Comer? Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes no. Mr. Owens? Mr. Owens votes no. Mr. Good? Mr. Good votes no. Ms. McLean? Ms. McLean votes no. Ms. Miller?
No.
Ms. Miller votes no. Ms. Steele? Ms. Steele votes no. Mr. Estes? Mr. Estes? Mr. Estes votes no. Ms. Letlow? Mr. Kiley? Mr. Kiley votes no. Mr. Bean? Mr. Bean votes no. Mr. Burleson? Mr. Burleson votes no. Mr. Moran? Mr. James? Mr. James votes no. Ms. Chavez-Reamer? Mr. Williams? Mr. Williams votes no. Ms. Houchin? Ms. Houchin votes no. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott votes yes. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Courtney? Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes aye. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes yes. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes aye. Mr. Desaulnier? Mr. Desaulnier votes aye. Mr. Norcross? Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes aye. Ms. McBath? Ms. McBath votes aye. Ms. Hayes? Ms. Hayes votes aye. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes yes. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes aye. Ms. Ledger Fernandez? Ms. Manning? Ms. Manning votes aye. Mr. Mervan? Mr. Bowman?
How is Ms. Bonamici recorded?
Ms. Bonamici is recorded as a no. Ms. Bonamici changes her vote to yes.
How is Ms. Chavez-Reamer recorded?
Ms. Chavez-Reamer is not recorded. Ms. Chavez-Reamer votes no.
The clerk will report the tally.
Madam Chair, on this vote, there are 22 ayes and 22 nays and 13 yeas.
The amendment is not adopted. We will now vote on the amendment offered by Mr. Scott, ASSUR _01.
Ms. Fox?
The clerk, I vote no.
Ms. Fox votes no. Mr. Wilson? Mr. Wilson votes no. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes no. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes no. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes no. Mr. Stefanik? Mr. Stefanik votes no. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes no. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes no. Mr. Comer? Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes no. Mr. Owens? Mr. Owens votes no. Mr. Good? Mr. Good votes no. Ms. McLean? Ms. McLean votes no. Ms. Miller? Ms. Miller votes no. Ms. Steele? Ms. Steele votes no. Mr. Estes? Mr. Estes votes no. Ms. Letlow? Mr. Kiley? Mr. Kiley votes no. Mr. Bean? Mr. Bean votes no. Mr. Burleson? Mr. Burleson votes no. Mr. Moran? Mr. James? Mr. James votes no. Ms. Chavez-Reamer? Ms. Chavez-Reamer votes no. Mr. Williams? Mr. Williams votes no. Ms. Houchin? Ms. Houchin votes no. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott votes aye. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Courtney? Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes aye. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes aye. Mr. Decano? Mr. Decano votes aye. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes aye. Mr. Saulnier? Mr. Saulnier votes aye. Mr. Norcross? Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes aye. Ms. McBath? Ms. McBath votes aye. Ms. Hayes? Ms. Hayes votes aye. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes aye. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes aye. Ms. Ledger-Fernandez? Ms. Manning? Ms. Manning votes aye. Mr. Mervan? Mr. Bowman?
The clerk will report the tally.
Madam Chair, on this vote, there are 13 ayes and 22 nays.
The amendment is not adopted. We will now be voting on the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6418. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I now entertain a motion to report the bill H.R. 6418 as amended and recognize Ms. Letlow. I now recognize Mr. Wilson.
I move the Committee on Education and Workforce report the bill H.R. 6418 to the House of Representatives with an amendment in the nature of a substitute and with the recommendation that the amendment be agreed to and the bill as amended do pass.
The question now occurs on reporting H.R. 6418 as amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Mr. Scott requests a recorded vote. A recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Fox?
Aye.
Ms. Fox votes aye. Mr. Wilson? Aye. Mr. Wilson votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes yes. Mr. Comer? Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes yes. Mr. Owens? Mr. Owens votes aye. Mr. Good? Mr. Good votes aye. Ms. McLean? Ms. McLean votes aye. Ms. Miller? Ms. Miller votes aye. Ms. Steele? Ms. Steele votes aye. Mr. Estes? Mr. Estes votes aye. Ms. Letlow? Mr. Kiley? Mr. Kiley votes aye. Mr. Bean? Mr. Bean votes aye. Mr. Burleson? Mr. Burleson votes aye. Mr. Moran? Mr. James? Mr. James votes aye. Ms. Chavez-Reamer? Ms. Chavez-Reamer votes aye. Mr. Williams? Mr. Williams votes aye. Ms. Houchin? Ms. Houchin votes aye. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott votes no. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Courtney? Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Decano? Mr. Decano votes no. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes no. Mr. Saulnier? Mr. Saulnier votes no. Mr. Norcross? Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Ms. McBath? Ms. McBath votes no. Ms. Hayes? Ms. Hayes votes no. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Ms. Ledger-Fernandez? Ms. Manning? Ms. Manning votes no. Mr. Mervan? Mr. Bowman?
The clerk will report the tally.
Madam Chair, on this vote, there are 22 ayes and 13 nays.
The ayes have it and the motion's agreed to. H.R. 6418 is ordered reported to the House of Representatives. The chair notes for the record that a quorum is present. I ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes to the bill as amended. Without objection, so ordered. Pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L, I give notice that all members have the requisite number of days to file supplemental, minority, additional, or dissenting views. Without objection, so ordered. We'll now be voting on one amendment to the bill, H.R. 3724, the amendment by Ms. Bonamici, AMD 3724_01. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Fox?
No.
Ms. Fox votes no. Mr. Wilson? No. Mr. Wilson votes no. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes no. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes no. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes no. Mr. Fonick? Mr. Fonick votes no. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes no. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes no. Mr. Comer? Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes no. Mr. Owens? Mr. Owens votes no. Mr. Good? Mr. Good votes no. Ms. McLean? Ms. McLean votes no. Ms. Miller? Ms. Miller votes no. Ms. Steele? Ms. Steele votes no. Mr. Estes? Mr. Estes votes no. Ms. Letlow? Mr. Kiley? Mr. Kiley votes no. Mr. Bean? Mr. Bean votes no. Mr. Burleson? Mr. Burleson votes no. Mr. Moran? Mr. James? Mr. James votes no. Ms. Chavez-Reamer? Ms. Chavez-Reamer votes no. Mr. Williams? Mr. Williams votes no. Ms. Houchin? Ms. Houchin votes no. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott votes yes. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Courtney? Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes yes. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes yes. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes yes. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes yes. Mr. Asalnier? Mr. Asalnier votes yes. Mr. Norcross? Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes aye. Ms. McBath? Ms. McBath votes aye. Ms. Hayes? Ms. Hayes votes aye. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes yes. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes aye. Ms. Ledger-Fernandez? Ms. Manning? Ms. Manning votes aye. Mr. Mervan? Mr. Mervan votes aye. Mr. Bowman? Mr. Comer is not recorded. Mr. Comer votes no.
The clerk will report the tally.
Madam Chair, on this vote, there are 14 yeas and 23 nays.
The amendment is not adopted. We'll now be voting on the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3724. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. Independent chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I now entertain a motion to report the bill H.R. 3724 as amended and recognize Mr. Owens.
Right here. Here, I got it.
Oh, sorry. I move the Committee on Education and Workforce support the bill H.R. 3724 to the House of Representatives with amendment in the nature of a substitute and with the recommendation that the amendment be agreed to and the bill be amended do pass.
The question now occurs on reporting H.R. 3724 as amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it and the motion is agreed to. Okay. Mr. Scott requests a recorded vote. A recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Fox?
Aye.
Ms. Fox votes aye. Mr. Wilson? Aye. Mr. Wilson votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Mr. Fonick? Mr. Fonick votes aye. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes yes. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes yes. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes yes. Mr. Owens? Mr. Owens votes aye. Mr. Good. Mr. Good votes aye. Ms. McLean. Ms. McLean votes yes. Ms. Miller. Ms. Miller votes yes. Ms. Steele. Ms. Steele votes aye. Mr. Estes. Mr. Estes votes aye. Ms. Lutlow. Ms. Lutlow votes aye. Mr. Kiley. Mr. Kiley votes aye. Mr. Bean. Mr. Bean votes aye. Mr. Burleson. Mr. Burleson votes aye. Mr. Moran. Mr. James. Mr. James votes aye. Ms. Chavez-Dreamer. Ms. Chavez-Dreamer votes yes. Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams votes aye. Ms. Houchin. Ms. Houchin votes yes. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott votes no. Mr. Grijalva. Mr. Courtney. Mr. Sablon. Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Wilson. Ms. Bonamici. Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Takano. Mr. Takano votes no. Ms. Adams. Ms. Adams votes no. Mr. Saulnier. Mr. Saulnier votes no. Mr. Norcross. Ms. Jayapal. Ms. Jayapal votes no. Ms. Wild. Ms. Wild votes no. Ms. McBath. Ms. McBath votes no. Ms. Hayes. Ms. Hayes votes no. Ms. Omar. Ms. Omar votes no. Ms. Stevens. Ms. Stevens votes no. Ms. Ledger-Fernandez. Ms. Manning. Ms. Manning votes no. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran votes no. Mr. Bowman.
The clerk will report the tally.
Madam Chair, on this vote, there are 24 ayes and 14 nays.
The ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. H.R. 3724 is ordered reported to the House of Representatives. The chair notes for the record that a quorum is present. I ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes to the bill as amended. Without objection, so ordered. Pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L, I give notice that all members have the requisite number of days to file supplemental, minority, additional, or dissenting views. Without objection, so ordered. We'll now be voting on the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7683 as amended. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I now entertain a motion to report the bill, H.R. 7683, as amended, and recognize Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I move the Committee on Education and Workforce report the bill H.R. 7683 to the House of Representatives with an amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended, and with the recommendation that the amendment be agreed to and the bill as amended do pass.
The question now occurs on reporting H.R. 7683 as amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Mr. Scott requests a recorded vote. A recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Fox.
Aye.
Ms. Fox votes aye. Mr. Wilson. Aye. Mr. Wilson votes aye. Mr. Thompson. Aye. Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg. Aye. Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Grothman. Aye. Mr. Grothman votes aye. Ms. Stefanik. Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen. Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Banks. Mr. Banks votes yes. Mr. Comer. Mr. Comer votes yes. Mr. Smucker. Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Owens. Mr. Owens votes aye. Mr. Good. Mr. Good votes aye. Ms. McLean. Ms. McLean votes yes. Ms. Miller. Ms. Miller votes aye. Ms. Steele. Ms. Steele votes aye. Mr. Estes. Mr. Estes votes aye. Ms. Lutlow. Ms. Lutlow votes aye. Mr. Kiley. Mr. Kiley votes aye. Mr. Bean. Mr. Bean votes aye. Mr. Burleson. Mr. Burleson votes aye. Mr. Moran. Mr. James. Mr. James. Mr. James votes yes. Ms. Chavez-Dreamer. Ms. Chavez-Dreamer votes yes. Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams votes yes. Ms. Houchin. Ms. Houchin votes yes. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott votes no. Mr. Grijalva. Mr. Courtney. Mr. Sablon. Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Wilson. Ms. Bonamici. Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Takano. Mr. Takano votes no. Ms. Adams. Ms. Adams votes no. Mr. Saulnier. Mr. Saulnier votes no. Mr. Norcross. Ms. Jayapal. Ms. Jayapal votes no. Ms. Wild. Ms. Wild votes no. Ms. McBath. Ms. McBath votes no. Ms. Hayes. Ms. Hayes votes no. Ms. Omar. Ms. Omar votes no. Ms. Stevens. Ms. Stevens votes no. Ms. Ledger-Fernandez. Ms. Manning. Ms. Manning votes no. Mr. Mervan. Mr. Mervan votes no. Mr. Bowman.
The clerk will report the tally.
Madam Chair, on this vote, there are 24 yeas and 14 nays.
The ayes have it, and the motion's agreed to. H.R. 7683 is ordered reported to the House of Representatives. The chair notes for the record that a quorum is present. I ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes to the bill as amended. Without objection, so ordered. Pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L, I give notice that all members have the requisite number of days to file supplemental, minority, additional, or dissenting views. Without objection, so ordered. Without objection, any members who wish to insert materials into the record may do so by submitting them to the committee clerk electronically by the end of the day today. If there's no further business before the committee, without objection, the committee stands adjourned.